In 1974, a single 35mm film print cost between $1.200 and $1.800 to produce and distribute to theaters across America. By 1982, that same print cost nearly $3.500, and yet, this is the part that changes everything. The number of theaters carrying that print was shrinking every year. What killed a movie theater wasn't the content. It wasn't television or home video or competition from other entertainment sources. What killed it was a silent financial revolution happening in the supply chain that almost nobody talks about. The real death of the theater business happened before the Blockbuster video store ever opened its doors. We all know the surface story. Movie attendance in America peaked in the early 1940s and began its long, slow decline. By the 1970s and 1980s, multiplexes were replacing single-screen theaters. Home video was supposedly the villain, but that's not where the economics actually broke down. If you owned a theater in 1972 and understood your business the way the best ones did, you were managing something far more complex than just selling tickets. You were managing a carefully balanced ecosystem where every dollar mattered, where distribution networks controlled your access to product, and where a single decision made 1,000 miles away could crater your entire profit margin in a single quarter. Let me take you inside the actual numbers that theater owners were wrestling with. A typical independent theater owner in the mid-1970s, not a chain, not a circuit, but a single owner running 1 or 2 screens in their town, was paying what the industry called the split with the studios. This wasn't a simple 50-50 arrangement. The studios owned the films. They controlled the release schedules, they decided which theaters got which movies and when, and they took their cut first, always. A typical split in the 1970s looked like this. The studio would take 60 to 70% of the box office revenue, the theater owner kept 30 to 40%. But, and this is crucial, the studio's percentage was calculated after what they called house nuts, which were their built-in deductions. House nuts included advertising costs, taxes, and a mysterious category called cooperative advertising funds. These weren't optional. The studio simply deducted them before calculating their split. So if your theater made $1.000 in a given week from ticket sales, the studio might deduct $2 in house nuts. Then they'd take 65% of the remaining $8 that left you, the owner, with $2. $800 for that week, but you still had to pay your staff, your utilities, your mortgage or rent, your insurance, and your maintenance. And that $2.800 was only what came from ticket sales. Your concession revenue was entirely yours. The popcorn, the candy, the drinks. This is where the real margin lived. A large popcorn that cost you 60 cents to produce and serve sold for $3. An 80% margin. The Coca-Cola fountain system, another massive margin play. By the 1970s, savvy theater owners understood that your survival depended almost entirely on concession sales. You were not actually in the business of showing movies. You were in the business of selling snacks in a dark room, and the movie was simply the draw that got people through the door. This is where the economics get genuinely interesting. In 1975, the average theater customer spent $1, 25 on a ticket and $1.10 on concessions. By 1982, the ticket price had risen to $3.50, a 180% increase, but concession spending had only risen to $1.40. This tells you something profound about the market. Consumers had a psychological limit to what they'd spend on going to the movies. As ticket prices climbed, they consumed fewer concessions. They'd skip the popcorn. They'd bring candy from home. They'd buy a single drink instead of 2. The studio's relentless price increases, justified by rising distribution costs and inflation, were cannibalizing the only revenue stream where a theater owner actually made real money. Now, here's what almost nobody understands about the economics of distribution in that era. When a studio had a blockbuster, and I mean a genuine blockbuster like Jaws in 1975 or Star Wars in 1977, they would intentionally saturate the market with prints. Jaws was shown in more than 1.000 simultaneously during its opening week. That was revolutionary. In previous decades, a successful film would open in maybe 300 theaters and expand slowly over months. But the business model changed in the 1970s. The studios realized they could make more money by front-loading revenues in the opening weekend and then cycling the print to other markets. This required printing and shipping thousands of film copies simultaneously, an enormous and expensive operation. But here's the hidden cost that theater owners bore. When your theater was forced to carry a film during its opening week because the studio wouldn't give you anything else, what we call forced booking, you had zero negotiating power over the split. You took whatever terms they offered. If Jaws was coming to your town, you were showing Jaws and you were paying whatever percentage the studio demanded. Independent owners couldn't say no. If you refused a major release, the studio would punish you on the next release, they'd hold back the film, they'd delay your access. Or they'd give preferential terms to another theater owner in your market. The major chains, AMC, General Cinemas, Lowe's, had corporate power and could negotiate. Independents had nothing. By the late 1970s, independent single-screen theaters were being crushed in a vice. On one side, the studios were pushing distribution costs onto the theaters themselves. On the other side, the multiplexes were opening in suburban shopping centers, which meant new competition right in the territory where you'd been the only game in town for 30 years. And on the third side, and there was always a third side, your audience was aging and your new audience was fragmenting. The demographics tell the story. In 1950, going to the movies was something almost every American did regularly, across all income levels and all age groups. By 1975, moviegoing had become heavily concentrated in the 14 to 24 age demographic. Adults, especially families with children, were going less frequently. This mattered enormously for your business model as a theater owner, because young audiences are price-sensitive in a particular way. They wanted cheap admission, and they wanted to see films repeatedly, sometimes 3, 4, 5 times in a row if a movie really caught on, but they barely bought concessions because they didn't have much money. Families, when they did go to the movies, would buy popcorn for the kids, but families were staying home more often, so your concession revenue was eroding even as your fixed costs remained constant. Your fixed costs as a theater owner were absolutely brutal in the mid to late 1970s. You had to staff the concession stand and the box office. You had to maintain the projection equipment, which was complex and sensitive machinery. You had to heat or cool the building. You had to pay property taxes, which were rising steadily. You had insurance, liability insurance because people got injured in your building. You had a mortgage or rent on the property. In an independent theater, these costs ran somewhere between $3 and $4 and $500 per week. Some of this scale varied based on the size of your market, but the fundamentals were the same everywhere. You needed a baseline revenue of roughly $4 per week just to break even. Anything below that, and you were losing money. But here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive, and this is the thing the standard history misses entirely. The reason movie theaters ultimately couldn't survive wasn't because home video technology got better. It wasn't because people stopped wanting to go to the movies. It was because the mathematical relationship between revenue and cost had shifted in a way that made small to medium-sized theaters structurally unviable. A theater that could seat 500 people and fill maybe 30 to 40% of those seats on a typical Thursday night was in serious trouble. That's 150 to 200 people paying $3 each. That's $4.50 to $6.0050 to $6.0000 in ticket revenue. Add concessions and you might hit $7.000 for the night. But your labor cost alone, just paying the ticket seller, the concession worker, and the projectionist, was running $1.50 to $2.0000. Your utilities were another $1. Your rent or mortgage was probably $4 for the night. If you're carrying a theater mortgage, you're already underwater. The multiplexes could survive because they had economies of scale. One projection operator could manage 3, 4, sometimes 5 screens. One concession stand could serve multiple theaters. One parking lot served all screens. One heating system served the entire building. But a single-screen theater couldn't achieve those savings. You still needed one full operator for your one screen. You still needed your own concession area. You still needed your own utilities and maintenance. The cost structure didn't scale down proportionally with revenue. This is the real economic law that killed single-screen theaters. Not market demand, but the stubborn mathematics of fixed costs in a declining revenue environment. And remember, this was all happening while the studios were implementing their own solution to falling revenues. They weren't in the business of subsidizing unprofitable theaters. They were in the business of moving product. If your theater was consistently showing weak box office numbers, the studios simply wouldn't give you the films you needed to survive. You wouldn't get early access to blockbusters. You'd get the films after they'd already opened in the multiplexes down the highway. Your audience knew this. Why drive to the old single-screen downtown when the new multiplex in the mall had the same movies and better parking? By 1983, the average independent theater owner was clearing about $10,000 a month after all expenses. That sounds reasonable until you factor in that this was the profit on a business asset worth $2,000 to $4,000. Your return on investment was 5 to 6% a year. You could make better money with your money in a basic savings account. You could retire, sell the property to a developer, and live off the proceeds. And many did. They didn't sell because they had to. They sold because they did the math and realized that their single-screen theater had become a burden, not a business. The studios actually accelerated this exit by making a seemingly innocent change. Starting in the late 1970s, they began releasing films simultaneously across hundreds of theaters, instead of in the traditional rolling expansion model. This meant that small-town theaters didn't get the benefit of being the only place showing a new film for several weeks or months. Everyone got it at the same time. If your town had a multiplex, the competition was instant. Your competitive advantage, being the only venue showing the new release, vanished overnight. This was disguised as a marketing innovation. The studios would claim that simultaneous releases meant better advertising efficiency and reduced piracy. But the real effect was to complete the extinction of the independent single-screen theater as a viable business. If you didn't have the economies of scale to handle 4 or 5 screens, and if you didn't have guaranteed access to the best content at the best terms, you were finished. What's fascinating about this history is that it reveals something essential about how American businesses actually die. They don't usually die because of one catastrophic force. Home video didn't kill the theaters. Television didn't kill them. What killed them was a structural misalignment between the cost structure of a business and the revenue-generating capacity of that business. Once that misalignment reached a certain point, no amount of good management or customer loyalty could reverse it. The math simply wouldn't work anymore. And that brings us to the real economic turning point, the moment when the movie theater business fundamentally changed from being about the theater as a gathering place and a destination to being about the film itself as a product, distributed through whatever channels maximize studio revenue. The theater owner's interests and the studio's interests had finally diverged completely. The studio wanted velocity, maximum revenue in the opening weekend. The theater owner wanted sustainability, steady, predictable revenue across the year that would allow the business to maintain itself. These two goals were no longer compatible. But here's where the story gets more complicated than just studios got greedy. The theater owners themselves had made a series of capital decisions that left them vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure. And this is crucial to understand because it reveals something deeper about how American businesses responded to uncertainty in the 1970s and 1980s. Throughout the 1970s, theater chains responded to declining per capita attendance by doing what seemed logical at the time. They built more screens. If one screen could no longer sustain the revenue a theater needed, then 4 screens or 8 or 12 screens could distribute the risk across multiple films, multiple showtimes, multiple audiences. This strategy had a seductive logic. It spread the fixed costs of the building, the property, the heat, the staff, across more revenue-generating assets. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it required massive capital investment at exactly the moment when theater owners were already experiencing margin compression. A single-screen movie palace from 1920 might have cost $5,000 to build. A multiplex with 8 screens in 1975 could cost $3 to $5 million. And that's in 1975 dollars. Theater chains borrowed heavily to fund this expansion. They justified the debt by projecting steady revenue growth. But the revenue didn't grow. Attendance continued declining. The debt remained. And here's what theater owners didn't fully account for. The multiplex strategy only worked if you could fill the screens. A single-screen theater with one film might have 300 seats. If that one film brought in 150 people on an average Tuesday, you had a 50% capacity utilization rate. That 50% could still be profitable, depending on your costs, because your entire operating structure was built for that reality. But an 8-screen multiplex in a market that still only had 150 total viewers for mainstream films that night had 8 50% full screens instead of 1 50% full screen. Your costs had gone up dramatically. You needed more staff, more utilities, more maintenance, but your revenue per screen had not. You were spreading the same customer base across more space. The math worked in the prospectus, it didn't work in the actual theater. This capital misallocation had another compounding effect. It left theater owners even more dependent on hit films to fill those screens. If you owned one screen and a film underperformed, you could rotate in a different film and still cover most of your costs. If you owned 8 screens and only one of them could book a genuine hit, the other 7 were operating at a loss. You became desperate for those tentpole releases. He became willing to accept whatever terms the studios demanded. You became trapped in exactly the kind of revenue-sharing model that was destroying your margins. And the studios knew this. They understood the theater owners' capital structure better than the owners themselves sometimes did. The studios knew that a chain with $5 million in debt and 8 screens in a mid-size market had no negotiating power. The studios could demand a 60% share of the opening weekend revenue, and what was the theater owner going to do? Book something else? There was nothing else. The hit films were the only product that could move the needle. Everything else was filler, and everyone knew it. This created a vicious cycle. Theater owners, desperate for revenue, kept building more screens, hoping to capture more films and more audiences. The studios, seeing screens proliferate, understood that they had more leverage than ever. Why negotiate with a theater owner when there were 10 other theater owners competing for the same limited number of hit releases? The supply of good films hadn't increased. The demand for screens had. The power imbalance became absolute. But there's another layer to this story that most theater financial analyses miss. The multiplex strategy, desperate as it was, actually did reveal something important about the true economics of movie theaters, something that had been hidden in the single-screen era, but became impossible to ignore once you had 8 screens operating in parallel. This had always been important, but it had always been obscured by the revenue from tickets. When a theater had 1 screen, 1 auditorium, 1 stream of customers moving through the lobby once or twice a day, the concession stand seemed like it was making good money. That one customer buying a popcorn and a Coke for $3 when they paid $2 for 50 for a ticket seemed like a nice supplement to the ticket revenue. But when you had 8 screens, you suddenly had 8 separate flows of customers, 8 separate moments when people moved through the lobby and past the concession stand. Your concession revenue could potentially increase dramatically if you could get your per-customer purchase rate up, or if you could increase your margins on the products you sold. But here was the problem. Concession margins, while high as a percentage, were still limited by what customers were willing to pay. In the 1960s, a ticket was about $2.50. Concession items, a small popcorn, a Coke, were about $1 to $1.50 combined. Customers accepted this. They came to see a movie, they bought a snack, they left happy. But in the 1980s, as ticket prices started rising to $4, then $5, then $6, theater owners started testing whether they could raise concession prices at the same rate. A large popcorn and a large Coke could now be $5 or $6. They were getting desperate. And here's where the psychology of the multiplex economy becomes interesting. Theater owners discovered, through necessity and through experimentation, that the concession stand's profitability had become almost decoupled from the actual success of the films being shown. You could have a slow night at the box office, but if you had a crowd in the lobby, you still made concession revenue. You could have a fast-selling Saturday night and people still move through the concession stand at roughly the same rate they did on Tuesday. This insight, that concession revenue could be somewhat independent of ticket revenue, drove a crucial realization. A theater didn't necessarily need to be packed to be profitable. It just needed to be open and generating concession transactions. A half-full screen on a Tuesday night was actually still generating reasonable revenue if you owned the building, controlled your labor costs, and managed your concession sales efficiently. This realization would become increasingly important in the late 1980s and 1990s, but in the early 1980s, it was still being understood in real time. Theater owners were discovering that they needed to think about their business differently. They weren't really in the movie business, they were in the real estate business. They owned a building that attracted a predictable customer flow, and that customer flow was the asset that mattered, regardless of which films were actually playing. This perspective, the theater as real estate play rather than as a film distribution channel, would have profound implications for how the industry evolved. But first, they had to survive the present moment, and the present moment was brutal. By the early 1980s, theater owners were hemorrhaging money in ways that simple accounting couldn't fully capture. The problem wasn't just declining attendance, though that was real and measurable. The problem was structural. They had built their entire financial model around a specific density of viewers per showing, and when that density dropped, the economics inverted almost overnight. Let's walk through what a multiplex operator actually faced during this period. A typical 8-screen theater complex in a mid-sized American city, say a market of 250,000 to 400,000 people, required a significant infrastructure. You had the building itself, which usually meant either owning the property outright or carrying a long-term lease. If you owned, you were looking at a mortgage payment of $8 to $1 2.00 per month on a $4 to $1 to $6 to $1 to one investment. If you leased, the landlord was charging you $4 to $7 monthly as a base rent. plus often a percentage of box office revenue. Then came the staffing. Even in the era of minimal labor, a multiplex required a manager earning $1.800 to $2.200 annually, 2 to 3 assistant managers at $1.200 to $1.500 each, and a rotating crew of projectionists, ushers, and concession workers. During peak hours, Friday and Saturday nights, and holiday periods, you needed bodies on the floor. You might employ 40 to 60 people total, though most were part-time at minimum wage. For a theater doing this volume, you were spending $1.80,000 to $2.40,000 annually on payroll and benefits. Utilities were another invisible drain. Heating, cooling, and lighting a 20,000 square foot building with industrial-grade systems ran $2 to $3.55 per month year-round. You had insurance, liability, property, workers' compensation, easily $8 to $1. $200 monthly, maintenance contracts for projection equipment, HVAC systems, and the elaborate sound systems that were becoming industry standard cost another $5,000 per month. Then there was the cost of the films themselves. Here's where most people misunderstand the theater business entirely. Filmmakers and studios were not handing over movies to theaters for free. Studios took a percentage of the box office, typically 45 to 50% for new major releases in their opening weeks, sometimes rising to 60% for blockbusters. As a film aged in theaters, that percentage dropped, meaning a theater could keep 75 to 85% of box office revenue on month-old movies, but virtually nothing on opening weekends for franchise films. This created a perverse incentive structure. The films that could fill seats, the big studio releases, were the films where theaters kept the smallest percentage of revenue. A theater owner might fill every seat in the house on opening weekend for a major action film or comedy, but the studio was taking $4 or $5 of every $8 ticket. Meanwhile, smaller independent films that came in at 55 to 60% studio take would play to nearly empty houses. The concession business was supposed to compensate for this squeeze. It always had been. Concessions, popcorn, candy, soda, hot dogs, represented what theater owners called the real margin. A large soda that cost $0.35 to produce was being sold for $2.50. Popcorn margins were even better, $0.40 of product cost and $3.50 retail price. The math was simple. Make money on the concessions, because the box office was already committed to the studios. But here's where the economics really broke down in the early 1980s. As attendance fell, concession per capita spending didn't rise proportionally to compensate. If you had 400 people in your theater on a Friday night in 1978 and 250 people in 1982, you couldn't raise soda prices from $2 to $3.50 without risking rebellion from families who were already choosing to stay home. You were locked into a slowly declining revenue base per screen while your fixed costs remained almost entirely fixed. A theater owner in 1982 might run the numbers like this. A single screen generating $6.00 in weekly box office revenue, of which the theater kept 35%, provided $2.00 in box office income per week. That same screen was pulling concession revenue of roughly $8.00 to $1.200 per week, so total weekly revenue per screen was approximately $2.900 to $3.300. On an 8-screen multiplex, that was $2.3200 to $2.6400 in total weekly revenue. Against this, the fixed costs were relentless. Just the mortgage or lease, utilities, insurance, and basic maintenance added up to $1.800 to $2.200 per month. That was $4.200 to $5. $100 per week. Add payroll of roughly $3.600 to $4.600 per week across the entire operation, and you were at $7.700 to $9.600 in weekly fixed costs. On $2.320 to $2.6400 in weekly revenue, you might clear $1.3600 to $1.8700 before taxes, marketing, and contingencies. That sounds sustainable until you realize the margins are already thinned. Theater owners couldn't maintain a reserve. They couldn't invest in new screens or upgrade projection equipment. They couldn't weather a bad quarter. And by 1982, bad quarters were becoming the norm. This was the moment when theater owners began thinking like real estate operators in earnest. The building itself, the physical asset, became more valuable to the owner's financial survival than the films playing inside it. If the theater business declined to the point of becoming unprofitable, the landlord could still offer the space to another tenant, or the owner could lease out portions of the building to other retailers, or they could simply sell the property. This is why so many theater companies began diversifying in the early 1980s. They weren't abandoning movies, they were hedging their bets. Some theaters added bingo halls, others added restaurants or game arcades, a few became event spaces for concerts and performances when film revenue dried up. They were extracting value from the real estate itself, not from the films. But there was another element to this shift in thinking that deserves careful attention. Theater owners were also beginning to understand something about their customer that would reshape the industry. The people coming to movie theaters were becoming increasingly selective. They weren't coming because movies were the default entertainment option, they were coming for specific experiences. In the 1970s, going to a movie was often a casual decision. Families would drive to the mall, see what was playing, buy a ticket. The movie itself was almost incidental to the social activity, the occasion to sit in public with other people, to have an air-conditioned experience away from home. But by the 1980s, this was changing. Television had become sophisticated enough that staying home was no longer a step down. Cable was offering more options. Home video rental was emerging. So the people who still chose to go to theaters were going for a reason. They were specifically interested in that particular film, or they wanted the theatrical experience, the large screen, the sound, the communal aspect. These were becoming conscious choices, not defaults, and this shifted the entire economic logic of theater ownership. Theater owners realized that they could no longer rely on volume. They had to think about optimizing the experience for the people who did come. This meant investing in better sound systems. Dolby Stereo was becoming a selling point. It meant maintaining the buildings to a higher standard. It meant thinking carefully about which films to book, because an empty screen was an even bigger financial disaster than a partially full one. And this is where we arrive at a crucial turning point in the economics of cinema that most people don't fully appreciate. The theater industry in the 1980s was forced to transform from a volume-based business into an experience-based business. That transformation had profound implications not just for profitability but for which theaters survived and which didn't. The small-town theaters, the single-screen operations that had dominated American communities from the 1920s through the 1970s, were the first casualties. These theaters had operated on the thinnest possible margins, often as community institutions where the owner took a modest salary just to keep the doors open. They couldn't invest in the technology upgrades that made the theatrical experience competitive. They couldn't book the blockbuster films that filled seats because those films required modern projection and sound equipment. By 1985, thousands of these theaters had closed permanently. The real estate went dark, or it was converted to other uses. Some became churches or community centers. Others simply sat empty, monuments to an era when the local movie house was the entertainment anchor of the American town. But the multiplexes, the modern 8-screen, 16-screen, and 20-screen facilities that had seemed like such an innovation in the 1970s, were also struggling, though in different ways. They had the technology, they had the locations in high-traffic retail zones, but they were saddled with the fixed costs of their infrastructure. The multiplexes would ultimately survive, but only those owners who could think like real estate developers, not just film exhibitors. They would need to weather several more years of declining attendance, rising costs, and studio pressure. They would need to understand that their profitability depended not on the films themselves, but on the building, the location, and the ecosystem of commerce surrounding it. This is the moment when we need to pause and ask a deeper question. If theaters couldn't make reliable money from movies anymore, how did the ones that survived actually generate profit? The answer requires looking at what happened in the second half of the 1980s, when a new generation of theater operators began testing new financial models, and some of them discovered ways to sustain the business that had nothing to do with box office revenue at all. If you want to dive much deeper into the actual cost structures, lease agreements, and the complete financial timeline of how theaters evolved from the golden age through their crisis years, we've created a detailed guide available in the description and pinned comment. Subscribe to the Ledger of Lost America, hit that notification bell, and join us next time when we follow one family-owned multiplex chain through the 1980s and uncover exactly how they stayed afloat when everyone else was going under. The revelation came quietly, without fanfare. Some theater owners realized something crucial in the mid-1980s. The movie business itself had become secondary to what else could happen inside those walls. And that realization, as counterintuitive as it sounds, saved the industry from complete collapse. The math was brutal but clear. A typical suburban multiplex showing 7 films across 4 screens might generate $40,000 in weekly box office revenue, but that $40,000 belonged almost entirely to the studios. After the studios cut, theater operators were left with perhaps $8,000 to $12,000 per week. Rent, labor, utilities, insurance. Before you paid any of those bills, you'd already spent $13,000 just keeping the doors open. But concession sales told a different story entirely. A single large popcorn, sold for $4.50 in 1986, cost the theater operator roughly 30 cents to produce. That was a margin of $4.20 on a single transaction. Multiply that across 500 or 1,000 customers per night, and suddenly you're generating $2,000, $3,000, sometimes $4,000 in pure profit from concessions alone. Not revenue, profit. This was the financial foundation that theater operators began to build on. The movie was no longer the primary product. The movie became the reason people gathered in a location where you could sell them high-margin consumables. It was a complete inversion of the business model. But this model had a hard ceiling. You couldn't generate enough profit from concessions alone to sustain a 10-screen multiplex. The math still didn't work perfectly. Theater owners needed the movies to be good enough, popular enough, to keep drawing audiences consistently. They needed hits. The difference was that now, if a movie underperformed, the theater owner had a backup revenue stream. They weren't completely dependent on box office anymore. The second strategic shift involved what happened in the auditoriums themselves. Some independent theater chains and single-location operators began leasing their screens during the day to other businesses. A theater owner in Ohio might rent out a screen Monday through Thursday afternoon to a local church for services. A theater in Missouri might lease screens to a video rental company for their promotional events or to high schools for assemblies. This transformed the theater building from a single-use facility into a multi-use revenue generator. On average, a theater owner could generate an additional $1,500 to $2,500 per week through these daytime leases. It wasn't enormous, but in an industry where profit margins had compressed to 2 or 3%, that extra income could mean the difference between staying open and shutting down. The third survival mechanism involved something darker: predatory concession pricing. Theater owners discovered that customers had developed an almost compulsive behavior. They came to a movie theater and they expected to buy concessions. It wasn't rational. A bottle of soda that cost 80 cents at a grocery store cost $2 inside the theater. Popcorn that could be made at home for 30 cents sold for $4. Candy that was available at a gas station for half the price cost 3 times as much at the theater. But customers didn't compare. They paid. Some theater operators began testing price elasticity. They'd slowly raise concession prices by 10 cents, then 20 cents, watching to see where customer behavior changed. Most chains discovered that you could raise prices dramatically without losing volume. A $2 soda could become $2.75. $3 popcorn could become $4.50. Customers complained certainly, but they paid. The theater operator had discovered that concession sales were less a business decision and more a tax that moviegoers were willing to bear. By the end of the 1980s, a well-run suburban multiplex could support the following financial profile. Box office would generate approximately 20% of total profit. Concession sales would generate 70 to 75%. Miscellaneous income, screen rentals, arcade revenue if they had one, parking in some cases, would make up the remainder. This fundamentally changed who could survive in the theater business. A theater operator who was good at managing movies, understanding film distribution, and building relationships with studios was no longer competitive. Success now required someone who was excellent at retail operations, margin management, and consumer psychology. The skill set shifted. The DNA of the industry changed. Some of the old guard, operators who had built their careers understanding how to negotiate with studios and optimize scheduling, found themselves unable to adapt. They couldn't accept that the movie had become secondary. They kept trying to compete on box office, kept trying to win the studio's favor by showing their films in premium times, kept believing that if they could just get the right mix of hits, the numbers would work out. They were fighting the previous war. The new breed of operators, often younger, sometimes coming from retail backgrounds, understood something the old guard did not. In the new era, the theater was a retail location where the primary draw happened to be movies. You weren't running a cinema. You were running a concession stand that showed films. Everything inverted. The physical spaces began to reflect this new understanding. Older theaters, which had been designed with large, ornate lobbies but small concession areas, began expensive renovations. Lobby spaces were expanded. Concession counters were enlarged, with separate lines for different items. The visual prominence of concessions increased. By the late 1980s, you could walk into a newly renovated multiplex and immediately understand the financial priority. The lobby was now essentially a retail environment where watching a movie was secondary. For the viewers who remember visiting theaters during this transition, you likely remember the shock of these renovations, the charm of the old theater experience, the grandeur, the sense of occasion, the feeling that you were escaping into a special place, gradually disappeared. What replaced it was something more efficient, more profitable, and significantly less magical. You weren't being ushered into a palace of dreams. You were being moved through a transaction funnel. The irony is that this survival strategy ultimately extended the life of the theatrical exhibition business by decades. By transforming the movie theater into a retail operation first and a cinema second, operators found ways to sustain profitability even as attendance declined. The business didn't die in the 1980s, it transformed. It became smaller, leaner, more dependent on volume, and fundamentally less rewarding to own for anyone who had loved cinema as an art form. But there's one final element to understand about this period, and it's perhaps the most important for understanding how businesses actually survive crisis. The operators who made it through the 1980s weren't necessarily the smartest about finance, though that helped. They weren't the most visionary about the future, though some had better instincts than others. They were simply the ones who remained willing to do the mundane work of running a retail business. They showed up, they counted the money, they managed inventory, they tracked which concession items sold and which didn't. They reduced costs obsessively. They understood that survival isn't usually about grand strategy. It's about relentless attention to margin and operational discipline. By 1990, the American movie theater landscape looked fundamentally different from 1975. Thousands of single-screen theaters had closed. Drive-ins had nearly disappeared. The grand palaces that once drew 500 customers on a random Wednesday evening were gone. What remained were multiplexes in suburban areas, and their profit structure had completely changed. The business survived, but the business that survived was not the same business that had defined American leisure in the post-war era. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson about how specific industries adapt to economic pressure. They don't always evolve toward something better. They evolve toward what generates the most margin with the least capital risk. Sometimes that evolution saves the industry, sometimes it destroys the thing that made the industry worth having in the first place. The theater business survived the 1980s. But movie theaters, as spaces of cultural significance and aesthetic experience, largely did not. For anyone who lived through this transition, who remembers the difference between a theater visit in 1975 and a theater visit in 1990, you understand intuitively what the numbers show. The business transformed into something more profitable and significantly less memorable. If you want to understand the complete financial mechanics, the actual lease agreements that theaters signed with studios, the detailed cost breakdowns of running a multiplex in different decades, and how specific theater chains navigated this transformation, you can find our comprehensive guide in the description and pinned comment. It walks through, decade by decade, how theater economics actually worked, and why certain operators survived while others disappeared. Thank you for watching this journey through one of America's most beloved and economically fragile institutions. If you found this breakdown of how theaters actually made and eventually couldn't make their money, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Ledger of Lost America, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden economics of the businesses that shaped American life. We'll see you